Welcome to creating web services using the ASP.NET Web API framework. In this easy-to-learn step-by-step tutorial, we will learn how to create web services using a small project. We are going to create various web services. We will also learn about dependency injection using the structure map framework. We are going to connect our application to the database using the entity framework. And we are going to create a GUI frontend which will use jQuery to consume those services. In Visual Studio, let us create a new project. Under Visual C# Web, let us select ASP.NET Web Application .NET Framework. Select an appropriate location for your project and give a name for your project, let's say Library Services, and click OK. Now in this screen, select Web API. After selecting Web API, click on Change Authentication and click on Individual User Accounts. And now click on OK. Now click OK here. It is creating the Library Services project. Now that you have created a Web API project, let's just run this. Click on Debug, Start Without Debugging. You will notice that the application started and by default it went to some kind of a local host and port number. This will happen automatically. So what exactly happened right here? Now this is not Web API. This is what we call an ASP.NET MVC page. Let us try to understand how this MVC page worked. Why did this page appear? And then we will go into Web API. When you clicked on Debug Start Without Debugging, what happened was this particular project was compiled and it was deployed to an IIS server. You will see your IIS Express server right here. This is inbuilt into your Visual Studio. You don't have to install it. So this project compiled and it deployed to IIS server. And by default, it called this particular application with the port number. You don't have to change the port number. This is selected by default. This is exactly the place your application was deployed in your IIS server. Now to understand how this page appeared, let us look at how MVC works. Now this is the MVC flow diagram. Now you may not understand everything that I say right now, but as and when we go through this tutorial, you will have a clearer picture. Now this local host, whatever the port number, is considered a request. It's like someone typing in yahoo.com or amazon.com. This local host and port number is considered a request. All requests by default go to a program called as a controller. Let us not worry about what a controller is. By default, it will go to a program called as a controller. This controller may or may not call a program called as a model. The model contains business logic. Business logic is any kind of calculation that you need to do, the model will contain those things. It may or may not fetch the data from the database. If you want some kind of a data from the database, the model class files will fetch the data from the database and then it will return it back to the controller. So the controller will make use of the model to fetch the data from the database and gets the data back into the controller. Then it will go and fetch an appropriate view. A view is nothing but the HTML pages or CSHTML pages where you can display the data. So it will go and fetch the appropriate view and it will combine the data with the view and display it to the end user. So this is a simple MVC flow diagram. So this request, because we did not specify which controller to call, by default it will call a controller called as home controller. By default it will call a controller called as a home controller. So here if you look at this particular project, there are some controllers and by default the application will call the home controller. This home controller has a method called as an index method. This is what we call an action method. These are called action methods. Since we did not specify what action method to call, by default it will call the index action method. So what will happen is this application will call the home controller's index action method. The home controller's index action method has something called as a viewback.title. Let's ignore this, but it will return something called as a view method. What exactly is this view method? This view method will call the web page. The home controller's index action method did not call any kind of a business logic or database. It simply calls the view method. The view method will return a web page. What web page will it return? You see this folder called as views. It will go to this views folder. In this views folder, it will look for a folder called as home, which is the same as the controller name. And in this home folder, it will look for a web page called as index.cshtml, which is the same as the action method name. So what it will do is, once it hits the view, it will see like, okay, is there a views folder under which there is a folder called home, under which there's a page called index? Then let us return that index.cshtml page. So based on the controller name and the action method name, it will go here and fetch that particular web page and return it. So this index.cshtml page is returned and we are seeing it right here. How can I prove it? Let's say over here at the very beginning, instead of saying ASP.NET, let me say ASP.NET. Let's type in ASP.NET Web Services. Now that we have saved it, let's go and refresh this page. You will see that ASP.NET Web Services has been printed right here. So this is nothing but the index.cshtml page. And this came about because by default, we call the home controller's index action method and it returned the particular web page from the views folder, home folder, index.cshtml page. Now you may wonder like, okay, who made the home controller and index action method as the default controller and default web page? Can we change it to something else as the default? Yes, you can. If you want to change, if you want to call some other controller, some other action method as the default, you can always change it right here. You can go to the app start folders, route config, and over here you can see that the default controller and action method is given right here. If you want, you can put some other controller name and some other index action method name as the default controller and action method. Now you may be wondering, what exactly is this on the top? This particular header, how do I change it? How did this come about here? Because if you notice in view home index page, you will notice that it starts with ASP.NET Web Services. So where exactly did this application name, home and API show up? Now what happens is, when this view home index page is being returned, it doesn't return only this page. It actually puts this entire page inside another page and then sends it back to us. Which page? So if you go to the views folder, under which you have the shared folder, under which you have the layout.cshtml, underscore layout.cshtml, this is the overall layout for any web page. This has all the header and footer information, something like this. So the layout.cshtml page will contain all the header and footer information like the company logo or contact us, which will apply for every page in your application. You don't want to go and insert your company logo in every page. So you want one page where I can insert the company logo, right? So that in future, if you want to change the contact us or company logo, you don't have to go to the thousands of web pages. You just want to go to one place and change the company logo or contact us. So we have a shared layout.cshtml, and this index.cshtml which is being returned is inserted into this shared layout and then returned to the user. So if you go to this shared layout page, over here you can change whatever you want. So instead of application name, I'm going to say patrickvideos.com. So it also has the menu items like home and API, which you see here. And if you go refresh this page, you can see that this particular application name has been changed to patrickvideos.com. So in this layout.cshtml, you will see something called as render body. So wherever it sees the render body, that's exactly the place where it will insert the index.cshtml page. So wherever it sees the render body, this index.cshtml page will be inserted. The code from index.cshtml will be inserted within this particular render body method, and the entire page, the layout page, is shown to the user. So here, this is the layout. the one on top and bottom, and this is the render body tag which contains the index.cshtml page. So here you can change in the footer something like contact us or something. Once you save it, you can come back here and you can see that over here you can refresh and it will become contact us. So this is the header and footer information in the layout, and this is the index.cshtml. Now this has nothing to do with web services. It's just for you to understand this ASP.NET MVC flow. If you want to learn more about ASP.NET MVC, buy my other video called ASP.NET MVC and Entity Framework. Now let us look at web services. You have something called as values controller over here. The values controller is our web services. You know that this is a web service because the values controller inherits from API controller. The home controller inherits from controller. So this is an ASP.NET MVC controller, whereas the values controller inherits from API controller. So that means this is a web service controller. Now, if you want to call the web services controller, the way you will call that is by using /API/values. /API/values. It is not case sensitive, like URLs are never case sensitive. So you will notice that when we say /API/values, you can see that it is returning this value 1 and value 2. So what exactly happened? When we said /API/values, it went to the values controller. And by default, it called the get method right here. It called the get action method right here. And the get method returned the value 1 and value 2, which was returned in this page over here, right here, value 1 and value 2. Let us add another value, save it. Now let us start the application again. Start without debugging. /API/values. You will see that it printed out value 1, value 2, and value 3. If you say /home/index, it will call the home controller's index action method, which is called by default anyway. So you don't really need the /home/index. This is the home controller index action method. But if you say /API/values, it will call the values controller and the HTTP get method. Imagine if you want to call the other get method, which takes in an ID. Let's concatenate this ID and return. So how do we call this get method? Let's save it, debug, start without debugging again. /API/values calls the regular get method, calls the get method that takes in no values. But if I give something like say /5, then it will call the get method that takes in some kind of a number. So it will go here. There are two get methods, but since we are saying /5 over here, it is intelligent enough to recognize like, hey, I need to call the get method that takes in some kind of a number. This 5 goes into ID. And it will return value space 5. Let's try it out. So you can see that it has returned value space 5. So this values controller, which inherits the API controller. So these methods over here, the two gets, the post and put and delete, these are all called as web services. Now that you have a basic understanding about how to call a controller and how to call a service inside those controllers, let us create a new controller and learn how to create web services. In the project, you will see a models folder. Let us create a new class file. Add new class. And let us create a class file called as book. Make sure that Visual C# is selected on the left-hand side. And in this book, let us create a model class file. Now, what exactly is a model class file? A model class file or an entity class file should mimic a table. For example, if you have a table called as book, let us create a class file called book. We will create a class file called book. And if the table called book has these columns like ID, title, and author, let us create properties in the class file called book with the names ID, title, and author. So here you can see that we have created the properties just like the column names in this particular table. So these are called model class files. Now let us create a new controller called books controller. Right click on controllers, click on add controller. Here select Web API 2 controller empty. Click on add. Let us give a name for the controller called book controller or books controller. It doesn't really matter. So I have named it as books controller, which you can see inherits from API controller. In this books controller, let us create a list of books. Just like we have records in this particular table, let us create an object of book for every record that we have. So let us create a list of books to represent this particular table. So we can say public list of books. Make sure that you're using the library services models folder equal to new list of book. So we have created a new list of books, and to this we want to add a bunch of books. So I'm going to say curly braces, semicolon, and to this we're going to add new book objects. ID equal to 1. So here we have created all the book objects. You can see them right here. So here we have created a bunch of book objects. You can see that I have created a new book object with ID equal to 1, title The Girl on Train, author Paula, publication here 2015, call number, and then you put a comma. And once you have created this particular object, put a comma and create another object and so on till we have the last object. Make sure that the last object does not have a comma, and then you're ending it with a curly braces right here. So this is how you create a list of book objects and insert them into the book. You can either do it this way, or after you create a list, you can create new book objects and add them to the list. So once we have the list of books, let us create two methods. Just like the values controller, let us create two methods, two get methods. These are called HTTP get methods. So I'm going to simply copy these two methods. These are called the web services. From the values controller, let's copy these two methods. Go to the books controller, paste them. So of course, we will be calling them API/books because the name of the controller is books. These are just comments. You don't have to worry about it. So this get method is going to return an IEnumerable of book. That means it's going to return a list of books, and here it's going to simply return this particular list. The name of the list is books, so we're simply going to return this list, which is nothing but an IEnumerable of book. IEnumerable is the superclass of list, so it will take all subclasses. It will take a list of books. The other get method, which takes in an ID, is not going to return a string. We want it to return a book. So it's going to return an HTTP action result. And what we want to do here is we want to search these list of books for a particular ID. So let's create var book equal to books. Let's search these books dot first or default. X becomes x dot ID is equal to ID. So what will happen is for a given ID, it will go search the list of books and it will return the first match for that particular ID. And if it is not able to match it, it will return null, that is first or default. Now here we are going to check if this particular book is equal to null, then let us return not found. This is an inbuilt method called not found. Else let us return OK and the object called book. So for a given ID, we will go search the list of books, and if it is found, we will return OK and the book object inside that. If it is not found, we will simply return this method called as not found. Now, how do we go about testing this? Now, since these web services are no longer returning strings, it will be very difficult to test them using a web browser. So to test these web services, we have tools called as POSTMAN or Fiddler. POSTMAN is the much easier tool to use. So let us download POSTMAN and test these web services using that tool. To download POSTMAN, all you need to do is Google POSTMAN, and here let's click on this POSTMAN API and download the app, POSTMAN for Windows. You can sign in if you want to, or you can skip the signing in and take me straight to the app. Let us close this. And now let us enter a basic GET request. Since we made a lot of changes over here, let us make sure that we click on debug start without debugging. We are starting this application again. Always click on debug start without debugging. Let us try out /API/values first. Let us take this URL, go to Postman and enter the same URL. You can see that localhost, whatever you have right here, you need to paste it over here. Do not use my port number. Use whatever port number it displays for you. /API/values, click on send. You will see that values 1, 2, and 3 are being returned. /5 or whatever the number, value 5. So these are the GET request in the values controller. So we were testing the GET request in the values controller, which returns string. Now let us test the books controller's GET requests. So what we're going to do is, instead of values, we are going to say books. This is nothing but the name of your controller, books, /API/books. Press send, and you will notice that by default it will call the get web service. You will notice that by default it will call the get web service, which will return the list of books right here. So we have returned the list of books. Let us query one of the books /2, and let us click on send. So when we say /2, what happens is, it will go to the get method that takes in an ID. It will come here, search for that particular ID 2 right here. And once it found that particular book, it will return that particular book as an IHTTP action result. And we are able to see this particular book. So we have now created a simple web service and tested them via Postman. Now that we have learned how to create simple web services, let us make it a bit more complex. A well-designed application will have multiple layers. For example, we have data over here and methods over here which query the data. But in the real world scenario, you will have a different layer for the data. So in this solution, let us create a new project for the data layer. So I'm going to right click on the solution, click on add, new project. Remember to right click on the solution, not on the project. Here select Visual C#, and here select class library .NET Framework. And I'm going to give the name of this project as library services.data, and I'm going to click on OK. So here we have another project in the same solution called library services.data. Let's delete this class.cs. And instead, in this project, let us create 3 folders. Right click on the project, add new folder. Let's create a folder called models, add new folder, another folder called repositories, and another folder called interfaces. So we have three new folders in this new project, data project, called interfaces, models, and repositories. Now let us go to the book class in the models folder in the library services. Let us copy this particular book class from the models folder in library services and paste it in the models folder in the data project. Once you have pasted it, make sure that you change the namespace to whatever the namespace you have right here. So this is going to be library services.data because the name of our project is library services.data.models. So library services.data.models is the name of our namespace. Make sure you do that. And over here, let us go delete the book.class from the models folder in our library services project. We no longer need this. Since we have moved the book class to the models folder in the data project. Now in the interfaces folder under data project, let us create a new interface. And let's call this interface iBook repository. Make sure you make it public. And in this, let us create two methods. So we are going to have two methods, getAllBooks, which is going to return a list of books, and getBook, which is going to take in an ID and return a book. Make sure you resolve it. Let us go to the repositories folder. And over here, let us create a class, and let's call this class as book repository. Make sure you name it as public. And let this book repository implement the iBook repository. And once you have done that, make sure the methods are implemented. Click on Implement Interface. Next, what we will do is, we will move the code from the books controller in the library services project. Let's go to the books controller, and we will move the data that is creating the list of books to the books repository. So I'm going to cut this entire data, move over to the book repository in the data project, and paste it over here. So now we will have a list of books in the book repository. So this project is going to represent our data. We have all the data listed over here. And for the method right here, getAllBooks, what we are going to do is, let's go back to the books controller. We will use return books over here. And similarly, for getBook to get one book, we are going to make use of the link from the books controller. And we're going to say return book. Now take note, this getAllBooks returns a list of books and getBook returns a book. They are not similar. This book repository class file methods are not similar to the ones in the books controller. In the books controller, you are returning an IEnumerable of book and an IHTTP action result. Whereas in the book repository, you're returning a list of books and you're returning one book. You're not returning an IHTTP action result. This is just to represent our data. Make sure you save everything. You will have compile errors. Do not try to compile it right now. We are going to have compile errors in this books controller because we no longer have the model called book in our previous project. In our library services, we no longer have the model called book. So you're going to have issues right here. Now let us go back to the books controller in our library services project. And here let us represent our library services data project. So now we have all our data right here in the library services.data project, you have your model, you have an interface which has two methods, getAllBooks and getBook, and you have the book repository which has a list of books which will either return all the books or return one book based on the ID. Now let us represent this particular project over here in the books controller. To do that, what we are going to do is, let us right click on references in the library services, click on add reference, select projects, and over here let us select library services.data over here. It would be in the projects menu. Select the library services.data and click on OK. Now we are adding a reference to the data project in our library services. So this library services can now access the data project. Now that we can access the data project, what we will do is we will create an instance of private iBook repository, the interface, and let's call it books, and make sure that you resolve that name. You can see that you are able to get that interface from the library services.data project. And we also know that whenever a class has an interface, make sure it is being set in the constructor. Otherwise, we may have a runtime issue. So let us create a constructor. And in this constructor, we're going to set the books field, the books property, to whatever is being passed in right here. Now we can resolve the IEnumerable of book to now point to the library services.data.models. And here what we will do is we will say return books dot, that is this iRepository, books dot get all books. The iBook repository has a method called getAllBooks which returns a list of books. So in the books controller, we are basically calling that interface's getAllBooks method. We still haven't specified what implementation of this iBook repository we are going to use. We will see that later on. If you want, you can also hard code it like this. You can say equal to new book repository. Book repository is the implementation of iBook repository. So you can specify, make sure you resolve this. So here we are saying like iBook repository books is equal to new book repository. If you're going to do it like this, you no longer need the constructor. Let me comment out the constructor and then use the constructor later on. So here we have an instance of book repository, and books.getAllBooks will call the getAllBooks from the book repository. I'm going to press F12 to go there, navigate. So it is going to return a list of books from here. And the same thing will happen over here. We will say books.getBook, and then we will pass in that same ID over here. So now what's going to happen is, in this particular books controller, we are going to get the ID. That ID is going to be passed to the book repository's getBook method. The book repository's getBook method is going to receive that ID, fetch that particular book, and return that book over here. It's going to return that book, and if that book is null, it's going to return not found, and if that book is not null, it's going to return that book in this OK method. So what we have done here is we moved the data from the books controller. We created a new project in the same solution called library services.data. We moved the data over there by using an interface and an implementation of the interface, and then we created a model. So we moved all the data related methods into a new project. And in the books controller, we simply created an instance of this book repository using the concept of superclass object equal to new subclass, or an interface object equal to new subclass. And here in these methods, we are basically calling the implementation methods from the book repository. The get will call the getAllBooks from the book repository. The get method with the ID will call the getBook from the book repository. Now let's test this out. When you compile it, you may have some errors because there are old references to library services.models because we used to have the book class over there. Let's delete those references. We don't need them. Build rebuild solution. And now let's debug start without debugging. Now that the application is started, let's go to Postman. Let's go to Postman and try out the same URLs. There should be no difference. Like if I click on get the localhost API/books, I should get the same results now too. I should get the same results. I can just select those links here on the left hand side, click on it, and then click on send. I should get the same results right now, even though we now have the data in a separate layer. We now have the data in a separate layer, and this is how professionally it's done. We have an interface, an implementation of the interface, and very soon we will see why did we create an interface and then an implementation of interface. Why didn't I just simply create a book repository? Let's look at it very soon. Now, usually in a professional environment, you will not hard code this iBook repository books equal to book repository, because tomorrow you may have a different implementation of that interface. So what you would do is you would use a constructor to set this particular books. So here you can see that I have a books controller which is going to take in an iBook repository object and set these particular books. So now let us comment this line off and just have this iBook repository of books over here. So I commented out this line and just have this iBook repository of books over here. So now that we have removed this particular line and we have decided to set this interface property in the constructor, how do we set it to book repository? We are not exactly creating an object of books controller anywhere in our application. So how can we call this constructor and set this particular property to book repository? We can use the concept of structure map. Structure map is a dependency injection framework. It will help us set these properties throughout our project. So to understand structure map, let us first install structure map. Let's go to the library services, references, right click on references, click on manage NuGet packages. This has to happen in the library services project. And here click on browse and search for structuremap.webapi2. Select and click on install. Click OK. Once structure map is installed, you will see a new folder show up right here called dependency resolution. Go to that particular folder. You will see a class file called as default registry.cs. Open that. And in the default registry, you will see a line something like for iExample use example. I'm going to copy that line, paste it, and instead of iExample, I'm going to say for iBook repository, use book repository. And make sure you resolve them. Use the library services.data.interfaces and library services.data.repositories. So what this does is, this is structure map. It's called a dependency injection framework. What it does is, anywhere in this application, it looks at this particular property called iBook repository. It will inject, it will use the book repository implementation of it. So in the books controller, it sees like iBook repository of books. It has to be set in the constructor, but there is nowhere we are creating an object of books controller to inject it. But you don't have to. Once you have set it up in the default registry, what will happen is when the application runs, it will see this particular line saying that for iBook repository, use book repository. So throughout the application, wherever it sees the iBook repository, it will use the book repository implementation. There is one more line that you need to write. In the application start folder, webapi config.cs, over here, you just have to make sure that we start the structure map services. We are going to say structure map webapi.start. Make sure you resolve the namespace. So we are going to call structure map webapi.start. This will start the dependency injection framework called structure map. Now let's run this particular project, build rebuild solution, debug start without debugging. Let's go to Postman and try to get all books. you'll see that it works perfectly the same way. It runs perfectly. But now we are using structure map, the dependency injection framework. All we did is we installed structure map from NuGet. In the books controller, we are going to inject the iBook repository. We are going to say like, let's use the book repository implementation. And in default registry, we are saying wherever you see iBook repository property, use the book repository implementation. And we also made sure that we start the structure map by calling in this line structure map web API dot start. Now in our project, we basically have only two web services, a get which will get all the books and a get with ID which will get one book. So let us create a few more services. Like let us create a web service that will add some books or remove a book or update a book. So let's create those web services.